Okay. All right. Well, welcome back. Our next two speakers are going to talk about whether we can really incentivize research integrity. And the first person to address this topic is Brian Martinson, who's with Health Partners Institute for Education and Research.
Thanks, Lynn. As I was just explaining to Elizabeth, oh, there's no keyboard. Now I'm stuck. Okay. I'm also affiliated with the VA. I'm a part-time researcher in both of these settings, and so I was initially not going to affiliate myself with the VA, but it is a fact that I'm a part-time researcher in both of these settings. I've lived the last 17 years of my life, which is the entirety of my career, in soft money settings, and that's partly why I'm in two settings right now, because it's getting increasingly difficult to fund oneself 95% of one's salary, and so that in part explains what I'm doing, but in part what I'm doing in the VA is also related to what I'm going to be talking about today as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about incentives, but I'm going to talk about disincentives and perverse incentives as well, hence the subtitle of my talk today. I may ask someone for help with this if I need. No, this is going to look all right. So I want to acknowledge some work, or some of the collaborators and the funders who have helped with some of the material that I'm going to present today. Of course, before I start all this, I need to go back and say thanks to the ILAR Roundtable, and Lita in particular, for the opportunity to help in planning this workshop, and now for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts about this with you. I am the consummate interloper here. I know probably the least about animal research of anyone in the room, but I am honored to be here today to take part in what I see as a very important conversation. So my colleagues Carol Thrush, Lauren Crane, Jim Wells, and Tina Gonzalez deserve a lot of credit for the good stuff you'll see. I will take credit for all the bad stuff. We have received generous funding from the National Institutes of Health, Michigan State University, and the Office of Research Integrity and DHHS. So what I would really like to do today is draw for you a circle. But given the time constraints, state of the evidence, and the complexity of the issues that are involved here, and the multifariousness of the issues, as someone drew that word out today, lovely, I am not going to be able to draw you that circle. So at best, what I think I will be able to do for you today, and others this morning in particular have helped me with this task, is to draw you a partial circle by giving you some tangent lines that will sort of define part of the outline of this circle. And we'll have to be satisfied with that. So let me begin by setting a little bit of background to this, to say it's important to tie this issue of reproducibility back to how it's related to some of the systemic issues that were addressed in this morning's talks. So there have been really three narratives that have been used to explain undesirable research-related behavior. Benjamin Sovacool, in a 2008 article, identified these three, what he calls narratives, that are used to understand this behavior. The first of which is the narrative of the individual impurity, which can also be referred to as the bad apple narrative. The second of these is the narrative of institutional failings. And the third of these narratives is that of systemic failings or structural failures in the science enterprise itself. And here I make an assertion that the science community, by and large, has overemphasized the bad apple narrative and underemphasized institutional and systemic factors. So most of what I'm going to be doing today is talking about the systemic narrative and the institutional narrative, and sort of in that order. So this narrative of systemic issues, I have elsewhere expressed my concerns about the systemic problems that seem to be undermining integrity and productivity in science, because I think partly what we're talking about with this reproducibility question has to do with productivity of science, the quality of the science, not just its quantity. So I will let you seek out my publications on this topic there. I'm not going to talk much further about those issues directly, although I will, again, tangent on them. But there are other voices with more authority than my own who have expressed such concerns as I express in those papers. So, for instance, in the end of 2010, Francis Collins had a nice editorial in Science, the very end of which he dropped this little tidbit here. A related issue that needs attention, though it will be controversial, is whether institutional incentives in the current system that encourage faculty to obtain up to 100% of their salary from grants are the best way to encourage productivity. I would also add to this Bruce Albert's editorial at a similar point in time, warning of an overbuilding of the research enterprise capacity resulting from soft money faculty positions such as those I have occupied my entire career. So really what I'm trying to do with most of the work I've been doing over the last 12 years is to put myself out of a job, by and large. While I do believe that there are some, as I have written, there are some reforms that are needed, I think that, that we also have to be thinking about what can be done in the local institutions, because we can't just wait for those reforms to happen. I will do everything in my power to try to bring them about, but I think that we have to also be thinking about what we can be doing in our own organizations while we work at achieving those larger reforms that I think are needed. Okay, so a very brief outline. The time limits today prevent me from going into depth on many of the topics at hand, but I want to give at least a sketch outline of several important points. In order to do so, I'm going to resort in some places to simply asserting things, because I don't have time to unpack the arguments behind some of these assertions. Trust me, I will argue with you outside of this room about them, but I may just have to assert some things. I'll try to alert you to when I'm going to do those things. So, okay, here's the order of the talk. I'm going to briefly touch on some of the systemic problems, as I've mentioned, but I want to try to put a little bit of a human face on this as well, because it's one thing to talk about these things in the abstract, but it's another thing to sort of bring them down to the nitty-gritty to say, how are they affecting the lives of the animals outside of the cages? All right, and then I'm going to briefly describe a recently developed tool for research organizations to use, and this is speaking to Malcolm's point earlier, to assess aspects of their local environment, many of which are related to the incentives and disincentives that I'm going to be discussing. And then ever so briefly, I'm going to present some evidence that these environmental conditions, the measures thereof, correlate, at least, with researcher-related behavior, and then time permitting, and I don't think it will. I'm going to offer some proposals, both modest and immodest. Again, those may have to be offered at dinner. Okay, so I'm going to start with a case study. These large systemic issues that we're dealing with, I think, are more well understood in the context of the human experience of them. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes discussing a case of misconduct, actual scientific misconduct, even though that's not mostly what we're discussing today. Let's agree. This occurred at my own alma mater, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I think this case nicely illustrates some of the incentives and disincentives of concern here, which is why I want to share it with you. I became aware of this case through a 2008 publication, actually in the alumni magazine, called On Wisconsin. The title of the article was Can of Worms. So just a sketch outline of the brief specifics of this case. So at UW-Madison, there was a lab studying the genetics of sex determination in the nematode worm C. elegans, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. As I said, I'm not an animal researcher. There was a tenure-track faculty member by the name of Elizabeth Goodwin who was accused by her own graduate students in her lab of misrepresenting findings in grant applications for funding to NIH. This resulted because there were two of the students, well, I believe two of the students who were attempting to replicate data that she had submitted in a grant application, and they were finding they could not replicate their PI's data. And they were confident enough in their own skills and abilities that they said, something's not right. But they agonized over this greatly because they knew if they were wrong, it was the end of their careers. If they were right, it was the end of her career and probably the end of theirs as well. So it was a no-win for these students, and they thought long and hard about whether they should come forward. Ultimately, they did. These allegations led to a university inquiry, as well as Goodman's resignation in 2006. Subsequently, an ORI investigation, Office of Research Integrity, for those who may not be familiar, ultimately led to a finding of misconduct. She was given probation instead of being jailed, made to pay some restitution to the government, and barred from obtaining federal research funding for several years, effectively ending her career. The last I've seen of her, I believe she's running a horse farm somewhere here on the East Coast, maybe in the Northeast. Okay, so those are the brief sketch outlines of the case. So one of the things I learned from the On Wisconsin article was about this very interesting database called Wormbase. This is a database that is developed and maintained by the worm research community for their own use and edification. So I think it's a great example of a tool for sharing research findings. So the things they learn about the organism, they have incentives to put into this database and share with one another in a fairly open fashion. So it's a somewhat unique resource. But one of the other things that was very interesting about this is that it tracks the researchers themselves. So here's a screenshot where I did a search. Anybody can go and do it. It's available online. You don't have to have a membership or anything. So Sidney Brenner was one of the pioneers in the field of C. elegans research. And here I've searched on his name, and I've found what I can learn about him from this database very quickly. So there's a variety of pieces of information. I can find out about his publications, I can find out about his lab affiliation, I can find out the dates when he's publishing, and I can also find out, interestingly, about his lineage. I can find out about the students, the PhDs and the postdocs that he himself has trained. This is a very interesting thing, as it turns out, for what I'm about to show you. So, Angela, if we could go to the Prezi at this point. And then full screen that little box in the corner. There you go. All right, so I'm going to give you a little storyboard here of the case of Elizabeth Goodwin, a family tree, or why cohort matters. All right, so let's see if this works the right way. All right, so I've introduced you to Sidney Brenner already. He's the pioneer of C. elegans research in the early 1970s. The worm-based database, as it turns out, also assigns a unique person number to each person in the database. Now, that's an interesting little thing, so keep your eye on those worm-based numbers as we proceed. So two of the PhDs who were mentees of Sidney Brenner include Phil Anderson, who I'll come back to in a moment, and David Hirsch. David Hirsch, worm-based person 259, trained Judith Kimball, who is worm-based person 320. Judith Kimball happened to be the postdoc advisor to Elizabeth Goodwin, who is worm-based person 213. So you see, they're not strictly sequential in the database. And I don't know exactly what the logic of assignment is, but I think they give you a sense of the size of the community, at least, that's captured in this worm-based database. So Elizabeth Goodwin had 5 PhD candidates at the time of the case coming to light who were in her lab. So of the 5, 2 of them I can't find any mention of in worm-based at all. Chantal Lee had a master's degree, and Sarah La Martina also had a master's degree in 06, doesn't appear in worm-based. Amy Hubert, one of the primary whistleblowers here, has her PhD, now at Stower's Institute for Medical Research in Kansas City. Mary Allen, I believe, finished her PhD in 2009, now at the University of Colorado Boulder, studying planaria worm, as I believe. Garrett Padilla left science, got a law degree, and now working as a patent attorney. I guess he didn't leave science so much. He changed his career track. All right, so back to Phil Anderson here, who was one of Sidney Brenner's students. So Phil, worm-based person 21, also had a lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the same department that Elizabeth Goodwin did. And at the time of this all coming down, this is what he had to say about the situation. I've thought about Liz a lot through this process. What she did, I believe, happened because of the extreme pressure we're all under to find funding. So in addition to making that statement, he also took Amy Hubert into his lab when things went south at Goodwin's lab, where she finished out her PhD. All right, so there's the little family tree. So let's go back and start again with this Sidney Brenner character a little bit and talk a little further. So over the course of his career, he mentored 33 PhDs or postdocs, from what I can divine from the worm-based database. These are his academic progeny, if you will. So one of those was David Hirsch, as we've already seen, worm-based person 259, who himself mentored 16 PhDs or postdocs. But based on the fact that we're now in the couple hundreds of worm-based numbers, it's clear that he was not alone in reproducing himself with lots of other worm-based researchers. So one of those that Hirsch trained was Judith Kimball, as we've established, worm-based person 320, who herself mentored 32 PhDs or postdocs, but again, along with her compatriots, engaging in their own academic reproduction. It's starting to get crowded in here. One of those was Elizabeth Goodwin, worm-based person 213. So what we know about Elizabeth Goodwin was that she was competing for resources, for faculty position, for pages in journals, for promotions, everything else, with now 3 times 10 to the second other worm-based persons, most of whom were still working in the field. Several hundred parrots, all right? It's as close as I could come to animal research. But what about those students in Goodwin's lab, right? Remember those? So Amy Hubert is worm-based person 3,474. Mary Allen, when I asked her about this about a year ago, did not know her worm-based number. I went and looked it up for her. It's worm-based person 4673. So these people in this cohort, in this generation, are now competing for funding, priority, positions, etc., with roughly 4 times 10 to the third other worm-based persons. So that's 3 orders of magnitude growth in the population of the worm-based research base over roughly 40 years. Now, I will say Sidney Brenner is no longer publishing. I think the last publication he had was maybe in 2003. But most of these other researchers who I've just shown to you, they're still actively working. They're still actively in the field of study. That's a lot of peeps. So, this is Nathan Kefitz. He's a pioneer in my own field of study, demography. And he was giving a talk at the University of Minnesota in 1983, somewhere towards the middle end of his career. And he had this to say about this situation. As a demographer, mind you, only long afterwards did it occur to any of us, myself included, that in the stationary condition to which every system must ultimately converge, each scholar can have one student who will take up his work, that is, one successor during the course of his entire career, not one per year, but one per 30 or more years. That just strikes me as a demographer saying that after the fact in the face of this data. All right, so there's the human face I wanted to put on the situation. So we can go back now to the main PowerPoint, Angela. Thank you. All right. So lest you think I'm picking on the worm researchers, I've had to single that field out just because that was the case that came to my attention that allowed me to sort of give you that narrative and step through that story. But the phenomenon is certainly not limited to just this one field. So over the past 3 decades, and this is data from a very recently published NSF report, science, engineering, and health graduate student populations have grown at a rate of roughly 1.8% annually, compound average growth rate. So that is the blue line that you see there, or the top line for those of you who are colorblind. Over the same period, the population of postdoctoral appointees in those same fields has grown at a rate of roughly 3.9% annually. This during a period of time when the U.S. population was hovering at around 1% growth rate, with a peak of about 1.4% in 1992. So clearly the populations are outgrowing, these populations are outgrowing the overall population. Now, over this roughly the same period of time, among those who hold doctorates in these fields who are employed in academia, the ratio of faculty to postdoctoral or other positions has declined dramatically. So what these two lines show you here is the ratio of faculty to postdocs in academia, and that ratio fell below unity in the early 1990s among those who were 1 to 3 years out from their doctorate, and by the late 1990s had fallen below unity for those even 4 to 7 years out from their doctorate. So, assertion, continued growth in the numbers of PhDs being produced, combined with the declining ratio of those PhDs obtaining faculty appointments versus postdocs or other positions, signals declining academic career prospects and increasing competition for resources. Now, others have alluded to the issue of resources, and many people have talked about them, so I'm not going to bother to talk about them any further. That is the other side of the equation, but I'm not going to belabor it here. So, I guess one question about these career prospects is whether the culture and the content of PhD training programs has kept pace with these and other changes, because there have been many, many changes in science over the last 20 to 30 years, some of which have been talked about today, but not nearly all. So just this past month, the editor of Science magazine published an editorial entitled "Think Outside the Lab." That editorial was written largely in response to the recent NSF report, as it turns out. You know, I was going to give you these quotes, but this is something I'm just going to sort of skip through here, because the point being made was just essentially, here you have a leader in the science community essentially recommending to newly minted PhDs, you want to do research, look somewhere else, okay? Look somewhere else. So the question I have is, that's a fine message to be coming from Marcia McNutt, but have the universities, the graduate training programs, NIH, or lab PIs gotten the memo on this? So here, I'm not sure. So Paula Stephan, in her 2012 book, How Economics Shape Science, has a very nice set of information about this in a couple of chapters, chapters 7 and 10 in particular I would recommend. But these are just some quotes from one particular part of the book about this topic. PhD programs have historically focused on training a workforce that would replicate the career of those doing the training. Job outcomes of recent graduates has typically not been readily available from graduate programs. The culture of the university stresses careers in academe rather than industry, and faculty know little about careers outside of academe. Okay, so at this point, I'm guessing that many of you are probably saying, all right, so what the hell does this have to do with replicability and the issue of reproducibility in animal research. Okay, so I guess I'm going to assertion. Context influences behavior. Now this one I'm going to back up a little bit. So in 2012, the social psychologist Dan Ariely published a popular press book entitled The Honest Truth About Dishonesty: How We Lie to Everyone, Especially Ourselves, which explored the environmental conditions under which most, if not all people, can be enticed into some level of cheating, or fudging as he refers to it. This has not been focused on academic researchers per se, but I think the lessons learned there are germane. Now a bit closer to home, last year James Lang published a book entitled Cheating Lessons, in which he attempted to determine the environmental conditions under which college students were the most likely to engage in academic dishonesty or cheating. And I would assert that cheating in an academic setting is just one form of corner cutting. Some other forms of corner cutting that we've considered today also falling into that same category. But all these things can undermine research quality. So Lang identified 5 contextual factors conducive to cheating: a strong emphasis on performance, very high stakes, NIH peer review anyone? Extrinsic motivation, a low expectation of success, and a peer culture that accepts or endorses corner cutting or cheating. So my view is that these recent lines of research in these areas outside of our areas of concern have done us all a great service by redirecting our attention away from the pursuit of identifying the traits or characteristics of bad apples or cheaters, and forcing us to recognize that the context in which people go about doing their work may directly influence the quality and the integrity of that work. So several months ago, some very eminent people in the science community published an article in PNAS entitled Rescuing U.S. Biomedical Research from Its Systemic Flaws. In that piece, they argued that the long-held but erroneous assumption of never-ending rapid growth in biomedical science has created an unsustainable, hyper-competitive system, making it difficult for seasoned investigators to produce their best work. They also had some observations about how this impacted junior and young researchers as well. But for my discussion here, I'm focusing on how it affects the existing scientists. Now, in 2008, Scott Rick and George Lowenstein defined hypercompetition as a visceral state that leads a person to take actions he or she would normally deem to be unacceptable. They also point to the work of Kahneman and Tversky from the late 70s, prospect theory, in which they note the loss aversion is a potentially much stronger motivating factor to behavior than is the potential for a gain. All right? This is very important because we've moved into an arena where the competition for ideas is not the same as the competition for career survival. I think someone today mentioned the increasingly fierce competition that's happening for resources. So fear of losing out on having a chosen career, fear of losing one's funding or one's lab, such as Elizabeth Goodwin might have been experiencing, the fear of not being able to continue support to one's graduate students or postdocs, all can lead to undesirable research-related behaviors. And if we worry that they may lead some into major transgressions, such as falsifying their data, we ought to be more concerned about the lesser transgressions and corner cutting that on a larger scale they may also induce, and because of their frequency, may actually be more damaging to the integrity of the science that we're up to. Yeah, I'm going to skip. Okay. So before I leave this institutional, this systemic problems narrative, I have to go to my favorite Richard Feynman quote. This is from a 1974 commencement address at Caltech. So I have just one wish for you, the good luck to be somewhere where you are free to maintain the kind of integrity I've described and where you do not feel forced by a need to maintain your position in the organization or financial support or so on to lose your integrity. May you have that freedom. Now, in '74, that probably looked quite quaint and charming. From the perspective of 2014, it looks to me a little bit more ominous a statement. All right, so let's go to this narrative of institutional issues. If the systemic issues get us thinking globally, the question remains, how do we act locally? For this, we need to consider the third narrative that I introduced earlier, that of institutional issues. This narrative is exemplified by a 2002 IOM report called Integrity in Scientific Research, Creating an Environment that Promotes Responsible Conduct. So that report explicitly recognized the role of local environment, the lab, the department, the university, as they may shape the behavior of scientists. And it recognized that environments can foster or undermine the integrity of behavior. So we're getting back to this question of the incentives and if we can incentivize good behavior. And this is important to focus on the institutional because the local environment is something over which institutional leaders ought to have some control and ought to have some ability to manipulate and change. So that report also promoted a performance-based, self-regulatory approach to fostering research integrity. It recommended that institutions that wanted to foster sound environments should do the following three things. They should establish and continuously measure their structures, processes, policies, and procedures. That's not an audit. That's not an audit. They should evaluate the institutional environment supporting integrity in the conduct of research. And they should use this knowledge for ongoing improvement. I think that's almost exactly what you said, was it not? All right, so this, and I guess I need to go back here because one of the things I want to note about this is a very important part of this, is that this is a very direct departure from a regulatory compliance framework. This is not saying you need to comply with the extrinsic demands of NSF or NIH or any other OIG or anybody else from the outside. This is about getting it right inside your own organization, getting the culture right, getting the climate right. So I think this is very important. And it's also focused on what is local and specific, what is needing attention in the local environment. It's not something that's subject to a one-size-fits-all dictate from the top down. All right, so the other thing about this is that this perspective, and again, I think this is something that Malcolm spoke about earlier, this perspective has a lot in common with recent initiatives to improve patient safety, particularly in hospitals. And the patient safety initiative got its start from other industries where high fidelity is very important. And industries like the aviation industry in particular, but also, for instance, nuclear warships, for instance. You have to have very high levels of fidelity in these systems. You don't want to rely upon human vigilance alone. You want systems that enforce integrity in some sense. So I'm going to talk, let's see, I may have to skip over some of this for time. The similarities with patient safety. Bear with me a second. All right. Lucian Leap was very much involved in the 2002 report to Err is Human. And in a subsequent publication, and I'm skipping over little pieces here because I don't want to belabor all of this. In a 2010 editorial, he noted there are three different main mechanisms that have been attempted to try to bring about positive change, particularly in patient safety settings. Regulation and accreditation, financial incentives, and reporting and feedback. Now, I've got slides I'm not going to go into on some of these. I think it's safe to say, though, that if regulation and accreditation worked, we wouldn't be having the conversation we're having today. Financial incentives, I've given you some of those, but how they work in perverse ways is important to consider. So let's go and talk about this reporting and feedback mechanism, because that's what I want to talk about for the rest of my time here. All right, so at the time of the 2002 IOM report, there were no gold standard measures available of institutional environments to facilitate the pursuit of this proactive, self-regulatory approach that they were recommending to integrity. But back in 2006, one of my colleagues, Carol Thrush, who I mentioned earlier, began work with a group down in Arkansas developing a tool using the IOM's conceptual framework. And then that led to some work that we were doing jointly that led to the development of this tool that we call the SOURCE, or the Survey of Organizational Research Climate, that measures key institutional level factors to deal with threats to integrity. The SOURCE focus is on measures of organizational structures and process in keeping with the recommendations of that IOM report. So what does the tool do? Well, first of all, what is organizational climate? I guess I should give you that definition, shouldn't I? So a recent book by Earhart, Schneider, and Macy on organizational climate and culture gives this definition, which I rather like. Organizational climate is the shared, meaning organizational members attached to the events, policies, practices, and procedures that they experience in their organization, and the behaviors that they see being rewarded, supported, and expected. What have I got? 4, 5? 4, okay. So this tool provides a self-assessment tool to organizations that they can use for assessing their own climate that's appropriate for use in a broad range of fields of study. We developed it and validated it in academic health settings, but we've also used it more broadly in several Big Ten universities as part of the CGS Project on Scholarly Integrity. And it provides institutional leaders with information about their baseline situation, and it also provides them metrics and, we believe, motivation to assess aspects of their climates that are both mutable and subject to change that they could mount initiatives to bring about change on. So there are 7 content domains that are measured by this instrument. I'm not going to belabor these. Quality of regulatory oversight, quality and availability of resources, the extent to which research integrity norms exist in the organization, the extent to which there are socialization activities that bring new researchers into those norms, the quality of advisor and advisee relations, the reasonableness of productivity expectations in one's department, and then a composite that talks about the actual presence of inhibitors of integrity in that environment. So those are the 7 main dimensions of this scale. 32 question items, so it's pretty brief, pretty easy to use. All right, so what are we measuring here? Shared perceptions of responsible research practices and conditions in local environments. So here are just some example questions from the tool. How committed are the senior administrators at your university to supporting responsible research? How consistently do the administrators in your department communicate high expectations for research integrity? And how effectively are junior researchers socialized about responsible research practices? Some more items here. The effectiveness of the educational opportunities, how respectful the IRBs and IACUCs are when they interact with the researchers, how true is it that people in your department are more competitive with one another than they are cooperative. And I'm not going to go into further, but these questions are fielded in an organizational population of members. That data is then taken and summarized into a summary report and fed back to the organizational leaders. Those leaders can include department chairs, deans, program leaders, or other university positions of leadership who are in a position to do something about it. In our view, this information is really for internal consumption. As I mentioned before, these are not reports that are to go back to NSF or to go back to any OIG. These are for them to self-assess to improve their own well-being in the organizational setting, to inform leaders, to support their efforts in research integrity, and to motivate them to make the changes that might be beneficial. All right, so I can measure the climate, big whoop. If it's not related to the behavior I'm concerned about, I don't really care, right? So let's talk about this for just a second. So in part of the validation study that we did, in a sample of roughly 1,000 faculty and postdocs in 40 of the top tier academic health centers in this nation, we also asked those responding to us to tell us about their own research-related behaviors across a number of dimensions. One of which I'm going to focus on here because I think it's most closely related to our topic is what we call neglect. We define this as having engaged in one or more of the following in the prior 3 years, based on self-report: inadequate record keeping, inadequate monitoring of research, cutting corners, or circumventing or ignoring certain aspects of materials handling research requirements. So, in our sample, 47% endorsed one or more of these items and said they had done this in the last 3 years. That only includes the people who were able to admit it to themselves and then were willing to admit it to us. So it undercounts the self-delusion factor, which who knows how big that is. And of those that admitted to any of these 4, nearly a quarter admitted to 3 of the 4, and more than half admitted to at least 2 of the 4. So I think this is a quality problem. This is a quality problem. This is not fraud. This is not data falsification. But this is a quality problem. It leads to irreproducibility, or it can. All right, so now I go to this slide, and I'm just going to skip over this just to say there's just too much here to talk about. But essentially, this slide demonstrates something from, go see the journal, the article was published in Science and Engineering Ethics, where we talk about using the source tool to predict these research-related behaviors. Just to let you know, the raw scores are over here. The raw scores of how each of these factors relates to logistic regression predicting that neglect composite that I just showed you. And then another set of regressions over here where we've included both the department means because it's shared perceptions of the environment that's important, and then how an individual deviated from their own department means. Both of those were included as predictors. And what we find is essentially they're both independently important in predicting. So the department climate perception is as important as the individual's perception of the situation. All right. So there we are. I'm going to skip over my proposals because I'm out of time. I want to thank you for your patience in listening to this sort of very fast run through a whole lot of material this late in the day. But again, I'd be happy to talk further with folks about this at dinner if you have appetite for such. Thanks again.
sorry, the time is short. And maybe, again, you can address some of those thoughts, your proposals, during our Q&A. Our last speaker of the day, but certainly not least, is Elizabeth Marincola. She comes to us with a world of experience and is currently the CEO of the Public Library of Science.
I retroactively yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Minnesota. What he had to say was a lot more interesting than what I have to say, so that was good, Brian. I'm also going to do something that I hate it when speakers do, but it's relevant because I feel like every job I've had up to now is leading me to this podium today, because everything I've done is really quite directly related to the topic at hand. I was, for 14 years, director of the American Society for Cell Biology, which at the time that I left, I felt like my contribution and Alice's and that of many other people to doubling the NIH budget was the proudest thing that had happened during the course of my tenure at the ACB, and now I'm feeling a little bit sheepish and ashamed that we didn't see this coming. But in any case, that is the fact that we were in the trenches at that time. I went on to be a CEO of a different nonprofit, one of whose activities included the Intel International Science and Engineering Fair, which did allow limited animal research because we took it despite protests at Intel shareholder meetings and so forth. We took a lot of flack, as did Intel. But we felt it was a really important teaching opportunity for these high school students who are clearly serious about going into science to learn something about good practices in animal research. There we talked about a fourth R also, but for that audience it was respect. I'm perfectly happy with 5 Rs adding reproducibility. Now, as Lynn mentioned, I'm CEO of PLOS. I'm very happy to be here with my colleague Damian Pattinson, who's editor-in-chief of our very large publication, PLOS One. You'll be hearing from him tomorrow. I wanted to mention PLOS because in that capacity, Damian and I participated in what I assumed was a related and coordinated conference on Monday, because it was also on reproducibility, but seeing that Damian and I were the only people present on Monday, they're also present here today. I guess it was just a coincidence, a happy coincidence for us of scheduling. But this was also on reproducibility and brought together funders and journals. And so we had the CEOs, the heads, directors, presidents, whatever the top person was, from HHMI, from NSF, from NIH, and so forth, Wellcome Trust, so the big funders around the world, or a representation of the big funders around the world, and Nature, PLOS, and some other big journals. And so I think that despite the tedium, perhaps, of the redundancy among all the speakers, you'll be reassured to know that not only in this room today has there been much, I would say, reassuring redundancy. There's tremendous redundancy between those constituencies and these in terms of the gravity of the problem and each of our respective groups' responsibility to tackle the problems. Somebody earlier today said something like, well, it's all very well and good, but unless the journals step up, for example, then we'll never get anywhere. It's absolutely true, or unless the funders step up, we'll never get anywhere. The journals and the funders said the exact same thing about themselves and about the other constituencies. So we've met the enemy, and she is us, all of us. And the good news is that that I think there's a convergence of we've been talking about this for years, but there's a real moment now, and I think there's a real opportunity to bring our collective good thinking and good intentions to bear. So I was asked to touch on this question of culture, probably as a result of a paper I wrote 15 years ago with labor economists from NBER and Harvard, Richard Freeman, as well as Frank Solomon from MIT, that flagged this, what we called a Malthusian crisis in biomedical research training. We saw this coming when we certainly weren't the first ones to see this coming. We were saying essentially what Varmus, Kirshner, Alberts, and Tillman said again last month, and that is, we're training too many people. It's what your colleague Nathan Kafitz identified, I guess, in the 30s or 40s, that oh, okay. He looks old to me. And that is, we're over replacing ourselves in all sciences, and perhaps it's most acutely felt in biomedical sciences because of the levels of funding and because of the relevance or perceived relevance to people's lives. And so, as our public engagement in science representatives were saying, people feel it, they taste it, they worry about it every day, they worry about their wine and their chocolate and their coffee and, you know, their anxieties and so forth. So it's very acute in the life sciences. I would like to touch on, to end the day on a somewhat positive note, the things that journals, and I will speak for PLOS, since that's the only journal I can, only suite of journals I can speak for, on what we're doing to really try to tackle this problem, what we're encouraging our colleague and competitor journals in both the commercial and non-commercial sectors to do. First of all, in March, we introduced and launched a new data policy for all of our journals, and this data policy requires the submission of all data that led to the findings that are being published in the paper under consideration to be submitted at the time, to be provided at the time of submission, preferably in a repository, but if not, as supplemental information. So this is incredibly important because this whole data not shown BS that we were seeing before, for which we got Snickers bars, is not acceptable in the PLOS journals anymore. It was always frowned upon, and I think any reputable journal frowns upon it, but we drew a line in the sand and said, if you want to publish with us, you have to provide your data. So we feel that that's a very important first step. We have also always encouraged the publication of negative results. We think it's really important to get relevant negative results out there. I think it was Malcolm who mentioned clinicaltrials.gov. And we are exploring mechanisms like in clinicaltrials.gov to, at minimum, require and perhaps, at minimum, encourage and perhaps require people, or at least give them an incentive to pre-register experiments with the understanding that they can have a fast track to publication in the PLOS journals if they execute the experiments that they said they would execute, regardless of what the result is. A valid negative result equal to a valid positive result. So we are very aware of these cultural and economic and labor pressures that are causing people consciously or unconsciously. I agree with Brian, and other speakers have said the really bad actors are very few, and they get disproportionate, appropriate, but disproportionate visibility. What's happening to almost all cases of poorly executed and or reported science is that people are on some conscious or subconscious or unconscious level responding to the pressures in their careers and their lives, and they are operating with bias. They are being told that if you just do 2 more experiments, we're going to take your paper into this prestigious journal, and lo and behold, the results of those 2 more experiments happen to turn out exactly as the reviewer wanted them to turn out. And it's just not a functional dynamic. We have to free ourselves from that kind of dysfunction. We do offer crossmark on all of our papers, and we're exploring opportunities for forward citation so that you do know if a paper has been retracted. I grant that retraction is the extreme of treatment. Most problems with publications are less dramatic problems, but it's incredibly important to be able to follow those forward and backwards in time, so we're not wasting time, resources, money, animals in reproducing things that have already been produced, again, whether negatively or positively. Of course, it's been pointed out also that the ARRIVE standards are great. We think they're a great first step, but there is a significant delta between the endorsement of the ARRIVE standards and the actual adoption and execution of those standards. So we have to work harder to create standards for blinding, for cherry picking, for sample size guarantees, and all the good practices that have been discussed today. I just want to take issue with one small thing that Henry Bourne said, even though I told him I agreed with nearly everything he said, including the slap at surgeons, which I feel I can endorse since my father, husband, and daughter are all surgeons. So I'm with you on that. That he said there are too few sufficiently prestigious journals. Who says a journal's prestigious? Who says we need a Nature Cell or Science paper to make our career? I grant, that's life now. But it's because we make it life now. We have got to move away from an environment where the title of where a paper is published is a proxy for the quality of that paper.
The journals have to participate in that activity.
Absolutely, by developing article-level metrics, as PLOS has invested millions in doing, to give people other, more credible measures of the validity of work, assigning more value to expert reviews than non-expert reviews, and a lot of other things like that. This leads me actually to the small reveal that I will share with you, because it's another attempt to get away from this proxy war that we seem to have gotten ourselves into in at least the life sciences, that's really destructive to individuals' careers as well as the field as a whole. And that is, we at PLOS have determined that we want to put our resources and energy, determination, and creativity into developing a viable form of post-publication peer review. We won't be the first, of course. Those things exist in F1000 Research and in PeerJ and other places, but we're really going to put all of our reputation and resources to bear on developing a system that works, so that papers don't suffer from harmful delays, so all of research isn't slowed down, and most importantly, so the entire process of research can be dynamic and transparent. So colleagues can see what each other is doing. We won't have wasted research. Open it up to the sunlight, let each other comment, find some way to harness the positivity and constructivism in those comments. I don't mean they have to be positive. And allow that process to unfold as part of our intellectual rigor, as opposed to condemning it to the filtering of a couple of gatekeepers who we know as peer reviewers, who are overburdened, who may or may not be the best experts in that field, who are volunteering that time, and who cannot possibly do as thorough and good a job as the whole world put together. So that's where I see, and I hope, biomedical research, scientific communication going. And I really hope, I'm very heartened by this day. I hope that we all can be working together, both on behalf of the particular problems of animal research and the appropriate use of animals, and on behalf of all of science, because I think that society itself will suffer if we don't. And I just want to admonish gently Conrad for apologizing for his English. We Americans would give our right arm to speak any other language as well as you speak English, and you and Jan and others probably speak a dozen languages that well, so kudos to you. Okay, that's all I had.
Thank you. Thank you very much. While people are coming up to the podium, I hope, to speak, I do have one quick question. And that's, have you looked at the impact? You were talking about the numbers of opportunities for postdocs to move into academic careers. Have you looked at the impact of the consolidation of the pharmaceutical industry and the number of lost positions there?
No.
No, okay.
But that said, I think there is a contraction happening there as well. I think there is a contraction happening elsewhere. My own organization, Health Partners, has contracted by about 12%. We're a small organization. We only do about $14 million of research a year. We've had a 12% contraction this past year, of 3 or 4 of those being investigator level. I'm sure that it's happening at the universities as well. It's overbuilt, and I don't know where people are going to get jobs at this point if they're not working in science journalism.
Believe me, there are no jobs in science.
No questions from the audience? Oh, okay, just being polite. Okay.
I may not be able to speak. Galen Edwards from the University of Georgia. Actually, a couple just comments. One, upper administration certainly is promoting, growing our graduate programs. We get that constantly, and they're throwing money at it. And as a department head, when there's money there, I'm going to go talk to them because we're always looking for money. So that's one problem. The other is I was listening to you talk about the shrinking workforce and the lack of jobs. I was thinking back 30-some years ago when I graduated from veterinary school, a faculty member told me that you'll be lucky to ever get a job in your chosen discipline, which was then immediately followed by this huge explosion in the number of jobs for veterinarians. I guess I'm a little curious about how confident you are in your crystal ball and the ability to project where we're going over the next 10, 20 years.
I'd stake my career on it. I have, honestly. There have been perennial calls over the last, longer than I've been, since before I was in diapers probably, saying shortage of scientists, shortage of scientists, shortage of scientists, there's going to be a crisis. Gathering storm, anyone? Yeah? So it has happened time and time again that they have cried shortage of scientists. Now, where I do think they're right is in the composition of the science workforce. We may have local shortages in specific areas. We may not have the right composition of the workforce. But in terms of its overall size, I am pretty sure we've got no shortage of scientists right now.
The other problem is something we've all implied but not said outright, and that is obviously a big problem with this is the length of the training period. And so it's not like training somebody to be a fry cook that you can train them up in a week and you can expand or consolidate the workforce and send them to another job if that one dries up. It's, as you know, it used to be that, you might do a year or two in a postdoc and then get a faculty position. Now people, in order to get that Cell, Nature, or Science paper, are postdocs for 10 years. And, if you're counting from the start of undergraduate years or even graduate school, people are well into their 40s before they're getting their first independent jobs. So it's really hard to, well, you know better than I do, it's hard to adjust on a dime.
I'm interested in the question of research institutions. Elizabeth mentioned funders and journals getting together, but I have the feeling that in the larger picture, and my bet is also with animal experimentation, if several leading research institutions don't get on this bandwagon in a major way, you're lost. That is, NIH depends on them to persuade Congress to give them money. Journals depend on them to produce papers. They're not going to do anything that will offend the institutions unless the institutions go along with it. Some way or another, this is something I've decided to devote my little energies to. I'm now going around and being Jeremiah at the University of Michigan and Santa Cruz and a lot of other places. And boy, it's very interesting to see what the response is. The young people and young faculty are absolutely fascinated by somebody who's actually interested in changing the system, and they find it just astonishing. A few of the older people are. There are especially ones who remember what it was like when it actually worked back in the 70s and 80s. But many of them don't want to fool with it. You guys and this group here is going to have to go after the institutions to get their goals to happen. Not every institution, but if 3 or 4 big ones came out and said something, by God, you'd have an effect, a real effect.
Henry, I couldn't agree with you more. I can't speak for the organizers of this conference that I attend on Monday, except to say that the first thing they said was, we realize institutions are not here. We just decide to take the first pass at the problem with this group, and we know that they have to be part of the conversation. Maybe because it was sponsored by Nature Publishing, the NIH, and Science Magazine. Those are the constituencies that they chose to have represented at that time. But I don't think anybody is naive, certainly not this group or not me, to the need to include institutions as part of that whole.
Well, Brian made it the point of his talk, actually.
So I want to elaborate, and I'm going to give you some of my immodest proposals. I think, Henry, you already know what some of these are, probably. So among the things that need to happen, so what we've got is a set of perverse incentives that exist between the funders and the institutions, and between the institutions and their faculty, right? My organization doesn't pay my salary. I'm entrepreneurial. I pay my own damn salary, and it's paid through federal funding, okay? So they've absconded from paying for the faculty who they're hiring. We also have the graduate student and postdoc labor. I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know here. They serve a labor function as well as a training function. We need to decouple these two things. Dramatically decoupling them would go a great distance towards solving some of these issues. In addition, so we need to do away with the soft money positions, exactly the kind of position I've occupied my entire career. So if anybody says I'm not serious about this, they're dead wrong. I'm trying to put myself out of a business, right? Because I've seen what it does. I've seen that it does not get us the kind of quality science that we need, that we want, that the public deserves. And so we get rid of the soft money positions. The universities are going to suffer pain. There will be contraction. There's going to be a loss of jobs. There's no question about it. You cannot resolve some of these issues that we have systemically without there being a contraction from where we are right now. It is unsustainably large, and it is not necessarily well composed to accomplish the science that we want. We're getting a lot of garbage. We're not necessarily getting the innovation that we're claiming we want to get by putting all the money into it. So you decouple the funding you decouple the training function from the labor function for grad students. You do away with the soft money positions. You realign the incentives between, and here's the other thing you need to do. The universities need to start competing with one another on grounds other than how many indirect dollars they're bringing in from NIH, all right? So I said this before a group of august people at UCSD back in 2007. UCSD had just lost out on a huge BP contract to one of their biggest competitors, Berkeley. And they were very upset about this. Berkeley and UIUC had just landed some big 50, I don't even remember how big it was. It was big, to do gas development of some sort. And they were smarting at this, and I said, you know, maybe it would be useful if all of you were to compete with Berkeley on grounds of your ethics and the quality of your research as opposed to the dollars that you're getting from industry. And they smiled politely and patted me on the head and said, yeah, wouldn't.
You're lucky they didn't take you up and shoot you.
I know. But so I do think that these are some of the things, though, that have to happen is to seriously realign these incentives. And I hadn't thought about Henry's point that getting certain vanguard leader organizations to do this, to unilaterally disarm, if you will, might be one way to sort of think about bringing about the change that's needed. But thanks for offering that.
Bob Disco from the University of Michigan, and you've already touched on where I was going to go with my question, and that is, you know, I'm at an institution that's within the top 10 of NIH funding, and what they're constantly looking for is to move one step higher or 2 steps higher. And I have a feeling that those in the next 10 are trying to get into the top 10, and those below that. So we really do need a means by which the institutions as a whole will value their research program besides just the total of NIH dollars. I think that's a big problem, and especially for those of us that deal with infrastructure, it impacts us often negatively when we have these efforts to try and bring in huge quantities of scientists in one fell swoop. I don't know if any of the other people from academia here are experiencing the same thing or have a different experience at their institution, but that's certainly what we're facing, and I think you're absolutely right. We need to find a different metric for them to look at and say, this means that we're a good scientific enterprise other than just a dollar value.
Brian was just reminding me in this paper that I wrote with Richard Freeman and Frank Solomon, we described the tournament model exactly as you described the problem. I couldn't help but thinking as you were speaking that this seems like it's a direct parallel to the problem of impact factors and ALMs. We realized that we had to find another way of talking about the value of a piece of research than the impact factor of the journal in which it was published. But it's all very well and fine to say U.S. News and World Report is harming all of us because these rankings are destructive and et cetera, if we don't offer something else. People want a shorthand. They want others to understand that it's better if their kid is going to Harvard than if they're going to, Foothill College. So that's why some serious thinking has to be put into these alternate metrics that are more realistic measures of the value of research or the value of a research program or anything else that you want to measure. These inane, rankings are just destructive in every environment in which they exist, in my opinion.
And just to add, our medical school administration has actually stated that being in the top 10 of NIH dollars links positively with the quality of the medical students who apply to the institution. And I mean, I haven't seen the paper that claims that, but they are very strong. Not only is it important for research, but it's important for who comes in as a medical student.
Well, even more crudely, in China, although if you ask any individual, they'll deny it, they provide a bounty to researchers who get their papers accepted in Western journals that is related to the impact factor of the journal. So if you can get your paper in a 3.0 paper, you get so much money. In a 5.0 journal, you get that much more money, et cetera. I mean, it's a direct pay to play. Yes, and it's a life-changing amount of money. So, yeah, it's gotten bad. And of course, we may not do something that crude in the United States, but the proxies aren't very distant.
So on that point of incentives, one of the things that I think could be done is, someone mentioned it sort of indirectly, I don't remember who it was, I apologize, my brain is full of everyone else's comments from today. That's a good thing, but it's also a little hard to manage sometimes. So one of the things we could do, I've learned that my organization pays attention to nothing so much as the indirect cost recovery rate, right? So what if we were to tie the indirect cost recovery rate to some measures of quality, some measures of success, such as, for instance, how few a % of your recently produced PhDs are in postdoctoral positions 4 years post, huh? Or some other, again, the metrics of quality.
Postdocs 10 years post.
I mean, again, the implementation is challenging, and I think predicting the future is hard, and the length of the training programs makes it difficult to know how many people we need. How many demographers do we need? Well, I'm pretty sure that we don't need as many as the demography training programs were producing when I got my PhD. But it's hard to know 10 years hence how many people do we need in a given field. So that is a challenge, I give you that. But I do think that aligning the incentives more correctly would get us to a place where we're in a better position to reestablish the social contracts. That's what I think's been broken here. The social contracts between the universities and the public and the funding agencies, and the social contracts between the universities and their faculty, and thereby the social contracts between the faculty and their students.
Okay. No more comments? I want to thank each and every one of the speakers today for a very informative and very thought-provoking day. I hope that all of you are leaving here with your brains filled, and that you will come back tomorrow refreshed and ready for continued conversation. So again, thank you all very much, and for those of you on the webinar, I appreciate your participation in a virtual sense. So, Ida? Okay, thank you.